So lately I've been thinking a lot about how fast the documentary film industry changes and how even within the span of my own career, I've seen a bunch of trends come and go. Moving time lapses were huge for a bit, and for a while, all my documentary filmmaking colleagues bought motion control sliders that are mostly now gathering dust. Or how everyone wanted the sharpest lenses possible in the early days of the digital revolution, and now we're all throwing mist filters in front of our lenses to break up the image. That got me thinking about what bandwagons I've been guilty of jumping on and which trends I think are worth ditching in 2023. So in this video, I'm going to go into 7 of these trends and why I think you should think about leaving them behind this year. I'm going to start with more creative and artistic stuff, and then I'm going to move on to some gear-related trends, and then at the end, I'll talk about the one new trend I'm actually excited about. So let's get right into it. Hey guys, welcome back, and if you're new here, my name is Luke Forsyth, and on this channel, I teach the skills I've learned over 10 years working as a documentary filmmaker and photographer. So trends are inevitable in all things in life, not just filmmaking. One day, low-rise jeans are essential for fashion, then the next day they're gone, and now, if an article that popped up on my social media feed is to be believed, they're back again. I'm not really sure how I feel about that or if I care one way or the other, but it's the way of the world. In filmmaking, we're just as susceptible to trends, and in the age of YouTube University, it can be really easy for a new thing to take off and then everyone is doing it or buying it. But sometimes it's good to take a look at what we're doing and figure out if they're really serving our projects or if we're just doing it because everyone else is doing it. And for me personally, there are at least 7 of these things that I'd love to see the back of this year. The first trend that's worth reconsidering wasn't even really an option when I started out, and that's the crazy overuse of high frame rates or slow motion. You used to need a really specialized camera to shoot anything much higher than 30 frames a second, but these days it's sort of surprising if your camera can't crank out continuous 120 4K. And don't get me wrong, that's really cool, and I'd never want to go back to having to rent fancy cameras just to get a bit of slow-mo, but it started to feel like shooting slow motion has become a crutch for filmmakers to create a fake sense of drama. From the horizon scanning hero shot at sunset to the super slow-mo blink, we've all seen so much slow motion these days, it's no longer a novelty. I'm not saying never to shoot in slow motion again, because when it's done well and for a reason, it can be super effective. But it has to be done with intention and for a reason, not just because it's available and it's an easy way to make a mundane moment look a bit more dramatic. If there's a reason for something to be slowed down, like a fast-moving event like sports or dancing or whatever, then great, go for it. But if you don't have good scenes to tell your story with in real time, the answer isn't just to overcrank everything and try and turn washing dishes or reading a book into a big serious moment that you can layer audio behind. To me, that's just lazy filmmaking, and I hope people ditch this trend and let their story do the talking, not the tech.
Let's get straight.
Building on that idea, the next trend I'd love to ditch is how blurry the lines between B-roll and scenes have gotten. B-roll is critical in filmmaking, and you're gonna need tons of it in post, but B-roll and a scene are not the same thing in documentaries. When documentary filmmaking is done well, we go on a journey with our characters and experience their lives through the camera. We wanna be there when things happen to them, and then watch as they grow and change. And the way we do that is by building scenes. A scene has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and as it plays out, we learn something new about our story as it happens in front of us. B-roll, or to put it another way, is a bunch of beauty shots strung together while we listen to a voice talking in the background. It's not a scene. Now don't misunderstand me, because B-roll is necessary and you should keep shooting it. But to get your filmmaking to the next level, try to start thinking about how you can build out real-time scenes with your characters where we see something actually happening or developing that speaks to their journey instead of just a pretty montage. And that goes hand in hand with the next trend I'd love to ditch, and that's explaining a story rather than showing it. So what does that mean exactly? Well, one of the golden rules of all good storytelling is to show, not tell people what's happening. It's so much less powerful to hear someone explain something than it is to watch that event or some representation of that event actually happen. I'll go back to an example of a project I was shooting in Mexico where we were interviewing a bunch of female assassins. We did a long interview with them where they answered all sorts of questions about what it was like being a killer and a mother at the same time, and while those were strong sound bites, we were having to explain the thing to viewers instead of showing them. Then, as the interview wrapped wrapped up, the woman's son burst into the room to ask a question about what was for dinner, I think, while she sat on the edge of the bed with an AK-47. She then explained to him what to get out of the fridge and then ruffled his head a bit and sent him on his way. Then on a shelf, I noticed a Mother's Day card that said, "I love you, Mama," in child's writing. That little moment and the detail of the card shows everything about the weird nature of being a paid assassin, but also a loving mother at the same time. And even edited down to 10 seconds, it's so much stronger than just 2 minutes of dialogue. Now don't misunderstand me here, talking head interviews are great and nearly every documentary ever made uses them. I'm just as guilty as anyone for sometimes overusing them because honestly it's easier. And as LED lighting gets to be so affordable, more people than ever can set up a great looking interview frame and it's tempting to let it tell the story for you. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but great stories show instead of telling. So nail that interview and make it look amazing, but try to find different ways to use them as little as possible. Okay, let's veer away from film theory for a moment and talk about gear and the equipment trends that I think are worth weaning ourselves away from. And the first one that's on my list is the old enemy, the gimbal.
No, not again.
Good morning.
A while ago, I made a video about 5 pieces of gear filmmakers don't need, and when I put gimbals on that list, a lot of people were not impressed. A bunch of people commented saying, "I love my gimbal for such and such a reason," or "I shoot real estate videos and I absolutely need a gimbal." All of that is totally valid, and if you need a gimbal, use a gimbal. I have one myself, and when the moment is right, it's a great piece of tech. But sometimes I see filmmakers shooting everything on a gimbal with the mindset that steadier is always better, and that's something that I think is worth getting away from this year. Documentaries are supposed to feel like immersive experiences where we're alongside the characters as they move through life and overcome challenges. Handheld camera work, wobbles and all, is, in my opinion, much more organic and effective in making it feel like we're part of the story. When I see entire films where there isn't any natural movement at all, I'm super aware that there's a piece of technology between me and the story. Everyone's entitled to a different opinion, and you don't have to like what I like, but I personally think most of the time handheld is the way to go. Now for a specialty shot of movement tracking or a specific moment where you want things to feel almost unnaturally smooth, like, I don't know, following a sports team out of a long tunnel or something, then go for it. I keep my gimbal around for exactly moments like these, but unless it's motivated, I say put the thing away. Along the same lines, drones and gimbals have developed pretty much side by side, and drones are probably even more common for filmmakers to have in their kits. I've had drones since the Phantom 3 came out, and flying them is pretty much expected of me on almost every shoot I do. They're amazing for establishing shots and giving a different perspective, but they're so accessible now that I often see drone shots being overused just because they look so cool. And they do look cool, I'm not denying that, but they need to be used sparingly, and like everything else we've talked about, with intention. I feel like I see a lot of docs that have drone shots everywhere, like every scene or moment or transition manages to cram a drone shot in somewhere. Because drone shots look amazing, it's really easy to want to use all of that beautiful drone footage you got at golden hour, but my advice is to kill your darlings and save the aerials for when they're gonna have maximum effect. For me personally, less is more when it comes to drone footage, and so that when you do finally use it, we appreciate the scale and perspective instead of just sort of being numb to it because we've already seen 20 before it. Again, I love drones and I've been flying them since way before they were a thing, so I'm not saying drones are bad at all. Just maybe think about scaling back on some of them and maybe try to limit the crazy speed ramped corkscrew moves sometimes. Okay, the last gear thing I'm going to talk about here is something you've probably already heard me say a bunch of times on this channel, and this is probably the opinion that gets me the most pushback online, but I think it's time to stop using autofocus as much, especially when you're covering a scene. Autofocus is amazing these days, and I use mine all the time, but when it's time to follow a character or build out a scene, manual focus is way better for me. Autofocus is a lifesaver when it comes to shooting interviews or when you're doing gimbal work, but if you're trying to flow with the action of a real-life moment, I think your cinematography will be better off in the long run if you learn to pull your own focus. Manually focusing means that you can actually flow with a moment and smoothly transition back and forth between different parts of a scene without needing to touch your camera screen all the time. Even when you're amazing at autofocus and have the speed tuned up just perfectly, when it does miss or when you accidentally touch the wrong thing, it's going to totally break the moment. Mistakes in manual focus hunting don't look nearly as bad for some reason, and people will forgive focus adjustments done by people most of the time because it looks natural. Autofocus hunting always looks terrible, and most of the time you'll have to scrap that part of the shot. A scenario I've personally experienced was when I was shooting on my FX3 and the character I was following dropped a small box that was really relevant to the story. The box was damaged and that mattered to them, so showing how it happened was an important shot. Using manual focus, you would just pan down, find your focus, maybe miss it by a few inches, and then come back the other way and settle on the object. Totally usable piece of storytelling. I was using autofocus though, and I did the whole pan thing and then tap the screen just off the object, and because they'd fallen on a black carpet in a dark room, the autofocus freaked out and started hunting. There was no salvaging that shot, and it sucked. Now the obvious answer is probably just don't mess up, but the problem is you can mess up with manual focus and recover smoothly, whereas most mix-ups with autofocus, things start to look pretty weird. If you don't shoot any verite and you mostly work with talking heads or gimbals or just don't generally shoot documentary scenes, then that changes things and you should just keep on doing what you're doing. But for me, I'm done with autofocus for normal scene coverage in 2023. Okay, I'll wrap this up by talking about one of the trends I'd most love to die this year, and that's over-the-top color grading. The grading tools we have now are amazing, and I love how good people are getting at it these days. I see docs made by people with very little experience that look like they were worked on by a professional colorist, and I love it. But I also see a lot of grading that is just way too much, and it totally ruins the mood for me. This is probably most common when people just drop a cinematic LUT or profile on their footage and then leave it at 100%. Or maybe when people are just starting to experiment with grading and they get carried away with how cool it all is. I love unusual colors or tones that really add to the mood of what I'm watching, and when stylized grading is done well, it's amazing. But when everything is way oversaturated and the characters' skin tones are all tinted green because of the power of the grade, it hurts more than it helps when it comes to documentaries. Now, I'm no master grader, and every time I try to go too deep into the subwheels and all that, I end up with something really weird looking and I have to tone it way, way down. So keep grading and keep experimenting, but maybe sleep on it before hitting export and ask yourself, does this still look real? On the sort of related flip side of that is the one trend I'm most excited about this year, and that's the mass exodus away from Premiere towards DaVinci Resolve. I've been using Premiere for over 20 years now, and it's coded into the way I think about film editing, but it's so flawed and so expensive now that I would love to be able to cancel my subscription. For a long time, that just really wasn't possible for the kind of work I was doing, but somehow Resolve has caught up, and every filmmaker out there seems to be jumping on the bandwagon. Blackmagic actually was cool enough to hook me up with a free studio version of Resolve, and very soon I'm gonna start wading in and trying to prep my first short project on there. I've heard really amazing things about what their AI can do, like background hum remover and auto transcriptions and a bunch of other stuff that would really speed up my editing. So stay tuned for videos coming up soon where I see if Resolve really is a good solution for documentary filmmakers who are frustrated with Adobe. That's it for this one, and let me know what you think in the comments. I'm sure I rubbed a few people the wrong way somewhere in there, or if you think there are any other filmmaking trends to ditch this year, let me know that too. See ya.